today's Bloomberg DNA webinar titled Healthy Data Management, Essential Strategies for Governing PHI, PII, and Highly Sensitive Data During an Acquisition or Divestiture. I have just a couple of announcements before we begin. First of all, thank you all for attending today's presentation. You have multiple options for audio today. If you select the dial-in option, please make sure your phone is on mute. And if you select the listen-only option, please make sure that the volume on your speakers are turned up. Questions will not be submitted by telephone. Questions may be submitted at any time via the Q&A pod at the lower right of your screen. Simply type your question and click the icon to the right to submit. Questions will be allowed to accumulate and will be addressed towards the end of the presentation or when our speakers deem appropriate. You will currently see instructions on how to earn credits for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions about continuing education credits, please email us at credits@bna.com. Instructions for downloading your certificates can be found in the files pod. In order to obtain CLE credits for attending today's presentation, you must answer all polling questions that are presented throughout the webinar. There is no submit button for multiple choice questions. If you would like to receive CLE credit for attending today's presentation, please make sure to answer the polling question at the end of the program accurately, which will ask for the jurisdiction where you wish to receive credit and your corresponding bar number. Your certificates will be ready to download in your classroom at learning.bna.com in the My Certificates tab generally within 1 business day of the presentation. A copy of the presentation you are about to see, as well as additional handouts, are available for you to download from the files pod to the right of your screen in order to provide you with takeaway reference material and details on obtaining CE credit. We would like to thank NEWIC for sponsoring today's program. NEWIC protects, informs, and empowers society in the knowledge age. Leading organizations around the world turn to NEWIC when they need fast, accurate answers for investigations, cybersecurity incident response, insider threats, litigation, regulation, privacy, risk management, and other essential challenges. I would now like to introduce today's speakers. Mr. Elliot Golding is a counsel in Kroll and Mooring, LLP's Privacy and Cybersecurity Group. Mr. Golding's practice emphasizes partnering with clients to develop efficient and effective privacy and cybersecurity solutions that enable business. Mr. Golding is a certified information privacy professional, United States, and co-chairs the e-Privacy Committee within the ABA section of Science and Technology Law. Mr. Jim Arnold is a managing director in KPMG's U.S. Forensic Technology Services and leads KPMG's Midwest Forensic Technology team. Mr. Arnold's legal and business skills bring effective results in matters relating to mergers and acquisitions, forensic technology investigations, e-discovery, cyber investigations, digital evidence recovery, data identification and remediation, and reasonable retention. Mr. Jeffrey Bridges is an information governance professional with more than 25 years' experience as an attorney and in records and information management, data protection, privacy, and information protection. He leads information governance for Boehringer Ingelheim, USA, and is responsible for those related operations for the United States. He also serves as data protection officer for the U.S. In this role, he is instrumental in ensuring compliance with the EU data protection directives governing transnational data exchanges. Since 1991, Mr. Brian T. Miller has advised clients in the areas of strategic and information planning projects with emphasis on new technologies, classifying content, and identifying the benefits of process improvement and technology enhancement. He is information governance product manager with NEWIC, and his responsibilities include guiding the information governance practice and managing the direction of NEWIC Sensitive Data Finder, NEWIC Management Console, and NEWIC Voice. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Brian T. Miller.
Greetings. Welcome to the webinar. Before I get started, I just wanted to say I'm very pleased with the panel that we've put together for you guys today. If you've been in the information governance industry for enough time, you should be familiar with the information governance reference model, which one of its major points is to emphasize the fact that information governance comes from having multiple perspectives, taking a view on different business activities. And what that means for us today is we've got some nice representation from the legal side, from the actual practical business side of things, from the records management side, security, privacy. We've got a nice collection of different perspectives. Hopefully we will find that most of them are consistent with each other and don't conflict with each other, but if we get into a fist fight, then we'll resolve it later. Basically what we put together for you today is we're going to present, first of all, a scenario. The reason we do this is to give you some context for why we're talking about the various things that we're talking about. There's two stages to this scenario. The first stage that we'll talk about in scenario A is proactive governance, which is really looking at, in this particular scenario that we're going to be going through, assuming that everything is business as usual, what should these companies be doing to make sure that good information management and good information governance practices are in place. Scenario B is the same scenario, except that we've now moved into a business-driven change within the organization. We're going to be talking about a divestiture. Some of the rules change, some of the activities change, but the overall information governance messages and the way we protect our privacy, the way we protect our information are going to be consistent. And so we're going to go through and this will be relatively informal structure. We're going to go back and forth and have conversations with this. Just to confirm that everybody's out there, Elliot, can you say hi to the group?
Hey, everybody. Pleased to be here.
Good. And Jeff, would you say hi?
Hi, good afternoon, folks.
And Jim, would you say hi?
I'm not here.
Okay. So hopefully you'll be able to recognize them from their voices as we go through. I may neglect to introduce them before they start talking, but you should be able to figure out who's who. So let's get started with our scenario. Once again, this is the proactive side. This is what you should be doing in an organization to make sure you've got good information practices and to make sure you're protecting and organizing your privacy-related data moving forward. There's two companies that we're going to have in our scenario. The first is Megacorp. They've been around for quite a while. They are expected to expand and acquire an additional business in their core business areas. The other organization is Mom and Pop's Drug Store and Sundries. Started as a family-owned drugstore in 1951, founded by Pop after his military service. It was a single storefront until Pop passed the daily operations of the business to Junior in 1982. Junior took over the daily operations of the business and through sharp business acumen grew the business to 40-plus stores in 6 states. So there's a couple quick takeaways from that, which is they've been around for a while. So if they have information governance practices in place, they're probably going to be stubborn about wanting to change things. They know what they do, and it's worked well for them, and they have a history of doing what they're doing. So moving into a different governance structure is kind of where we want to focus this discussion. How do we set up that structure in the first place? Continuing on, commencing in the late 80s, Mom and Pop began relying on technology in managing inventory, customer lists, expanding that use over time so that the operation was a picture of efficiency. So keep in mind, although they've got a long-term governance structure, whether it's well structured or not, we have yet to see, but it is fairly entrenched. Plus, they've got good, strong technology, which means they're going to be very reluctant to want to try and change things too quickly. So we want to take that slow and careful and understand that there may be differences in the way these two organizations build their information governance and manage their information moving forward. In 2006, Megacorp acquired Mom and Pop's, allowing it to retain its unique name and identity. Megacorp integrated Mom and Pop's data into its network. Keep in mind that this is a relative term. Some data integrates very quickly and easily. Some stuff may never get integrated, but they've tried hard in this organization to bring them all together. So we're going to move forward and start asking some questions and learn a little bit about information governance and how this all ties it together. So I'm going to ask the first question to Elliot. From a corporate policy and framework perspective, what should Megacorp at this point be doing?
Thanks very much for teeing that off. I'm going to break this down into 9 essential steps. This isn't going to cover everything that all companies should do, but these are commonalities that we see across clients that have good information governance. And really the first step to have good information governance is figuring out, well, what information do we even have? So in this scenario, we're talking about a company that at least in part is a pharmacy, which is going to make it a covered entity under HIPAA. So figuring out where is all of that PHI that we have, what systems is it in, what PHI do we have. But even beyond that, there's probably going to be other types of data we need to get a handle on. For example, maybe we're collecting customer information through the store unconnected to pharmacy, and that's going to potentially be personal information under state laws. Maybe we want to be concerned about all the payment card data we have when processing credit card transactions. Maybe there's third-party data that we get and have an obligation to protect. And, of course, there's things like trade secrets and sensitive IP and pricing data. But figuring out first what data there is and what systems it's on is just completely necessary to do the rest of it. And for those entities that are subject to HIPAA, it's really the first step in even doing the risk assessment that HIPAA requires. So the second step is figuring out what controls are you going to implement to protect that data. And so for the entity that's subject to HIPAA, and this is sort of a complex situation where maybe one business unit of Megacorp is a covered entity, so maybe they're a component entity or not, but at least with respect to the PHI, that means complying with the security rule. Because as we saw in the scenario, all their data, for the most part, is going to be electronic. And I'm not going to go into the security rule too much, but that means having the right administrative, physical, technical, organizational controls. But for our purposes, really the most important part of that is conducting the risk assessment. And as we've seen time and time again from OCR, that is a priority and a focus right now, and there still seems to be a disconnect between what the regulator thinks is a good risk assessment and what companies are actually doing. And this process that we're talking about, this framework, is a lot more aligned to what OCR wants. Where's your data? What are the risks to it? What are the threats? What are the vulnerabilities? And what controls are you going to implement to reduce those risks to a reasonable level? So with the controls, HIPAA is going to be a main driver, but there's also a lot of other laws that may apply. So for just personal information, we have state laws that require certain security. California's been at the forefront of this and recently said, well, if you're not adopting the 20 controls in the ISC-CSC, well, that's not reasonable security. And I think that came as a shock to a lot of people, and given how active California can be in regulatory actions, that's an important thing. If there's PCI data, that means implementing the payment card industry data security standards, which can be a pretty burdensome task for a lot of entities. In another case, the FTC has guidance. They've 50, 60 data security enforcement actions now, and have put out guidance on what they expect reasonable security to be. So those are all just examples of implementing controls that are necessary to protect your data as part of good information governance. The third step is really more about your people governance. And that, the most critical thing there is, well, what are each person's roles and responsibilities? Too many times, when we're working with a client who's had a breach, we go in and we, look at who was responsible for what, and everyone sort of points the finger at each other. Or they don't even know each other. And you don't want to be, trading business cards on the battlefield. You want to make sure that people know who is in charge of what, make sure there's an open communication structure, make sure there's accountability. If you have a lot of great policies, but no one's implementing them, or no one's making sure that violations are enforced, well, that doesn't really do you too well. So really figuring out what are your processes in place to make sure that the people are talking and make sure accountability. And incorporating all that with audit on the back end is really a critical component. So moving along to the fourth step here.
Elliot, before you go on, let me just interject a quick question that came from the audience. There was a question about how do we define or explain or provide examples for what is PHI, PII, and I would also add PCI.
Sure. Well, for just a 30-second explanation of PHI, HIPAA applies based on the type of entity, not necessarily based on type of information. And what I mean by that is, although protected health information means information about an individual's health status, treatment, or payment that can identify the person, it's only PHI when it's being created or received by certain types of entities called covered entities, which is basically a provider, a health plan, or a clearinghouse, or being handled by a business associate of a covered entity, which is just an entity that handles it on behalf of the covered entity. So that's a high level what PHI means, but it's defined in such a broad way that you end up making these almost metaphysical distinctions of, well, is someone's address combined with the provider's name PHI? Well, maybe. It could be. But it needs to be connected to a covered entity for it to be PHI. Personal information is defined by various laws in very different ways. For purposes of most state breach laws, which I think is what most people are going to be concerned about the most, it's typically going to be an actual name combined with either a social security number, account number, credit or debit card number, and in some states, medical information. But now that there are 47 states that have a law, there's a lot of variation. So those are just at a high level what those two mean. Payment card data is what it sounds like. It's your credit card data, it's the magnetic strip, it's the CVC code, all of those things as well. So I hope I answered that question. But moving on to number 4, this is where the sort of the paper is important. And we see time and time again that regulators really want to see that companies have thought through these issues enough to put them on paper, and that they're continuing to update them and look at them again on a regular basis. So when we say policy and procedures, what are we talking about? I think the fundamental parts of a good information governance program really comes down to about 5 or 6 key policies. And these are the policies that are going to be governing how the company handles information throughout its life cycle, from creation to destruction. And really the first one, I think, is a data classification system. Most companies are going to have a ton of data, and some of it's going to be regulated, like PHI or PII, but a lot of it's probably not. Figuring out how to classify that data into maybe a public category, a confidential category, a highly confidential category is really important because it helps drive the restrictions throughout the company on how that data is going to be used and disclosed. And that brings us to really the second foundational policy, which is privacy policies. And there's 2 types. One is your internal-facing statements about these are the rules for how our company will use and disclose data. And for an entity subject to HIPAA, those rules are going to be pretty clear in the HIPAA privacy rule. But even outside of that, there are a ton of best practices that state regulators and other regimes will expect you to follow on how data is used and how data is disclosed. The second privacy one is your external-facing privacy statement, which is your representations to the public. In California, there's a law that requires having a privacy statement on your website, and that's sort of trickled down really throughout the world as a requirement and best practice if the website might be reaching into California, if California consumers go there. So a statement that says what information you collect, how you use it, how you disclose it to third parties, and a couple of other key parts. But the most important thing is do what you say and say what you do. Because if you don't, then the FTC will come knocking on your door for making misrepresentations. The third major component is really your security policies, which is going to cover both cyber and your physical security. And really, you're going to have probably 2 sets of those. One's your IT level policies that has a lot of the details, but probably equally important for good information governance is an acceptable use policy, which tells your employees how they're allowed to handle data and what requirements apply to them, and that's to really manage risk. That's a really key one. The other 2, I'll just touch on briefly. One's having a good document retention and destruction policy, and I won't talk a lot about that because some of the other speakers are going to cover that in more detail, but really having a good policy in place that sets forth the process to know, well, when is it time to delete this data? And some data you might keep forever, but some data you don't want to because it creates a lot of risk. If you get stuck in litigation and you have infinite amount of emails from the beginning of the company, well, that's going to make discovery very expensive. So having a reasonable, defensible way to delete documents is important. And then the final one is really a privacy impact assessment process. So as you get new data or have new systems, how do you assess what the privacy risks are associated with that data? It's something that's sort of required in the government. More and more private companies are doing it because it's a really good governance system, but not strictly required. So moving on to the really 5th step, which is to prepare for an incident, and the first component of that is an incident response plan, which is really an important part of the policy procedures as well. What's an incident response plan? Well, the way that we look at it when we create these there's really the before and the after. Your incident response plan should have some defined governance in place for how incidents are detected and addressed. So what's the intake process? How are you going to escalate an incident within the organization and make sure the right people are involved? Who's in charge of mitigation and remediation? If notification is required, under HIPAA or state laws, who's going to be doing that, and who's in charge of that? Are your communications people being involved? Do you bring in your legal counsel to make sure that your investigation is privileged, et cetera? But just as much as that, having a toolkit on the back end is really helpful. Maybe retaining vendors in advance who provide credit monitoring, having a list of the state laws and what those requirements are, having sample letters in place. You're not recreating the wheel from scratch if an incident does occur. But in addition to really having that paper, it's important to practice. Because a lot of companies will have a great policy on paper and it sits on a shelf and no one ever looks at it, and then when an incident happens, everyone's scrambling. So we always try to do tabletop exercises. Get all the people in a room together that are going to be in charge of incident response and come up with a pretend scenario and actually have people talk through, well, what would you actually do? Maybe that's a half-day exercise, maybe it's a full-day exercise, but at least once a year to practice and make sure it's still current. So I'm going to move on to the sixth step, unless anyone wants to jump in, but really the sixth step is thinking about your external risks. And what we're seeing as a really big external risk today is your vendor supply chain. And having good vendor management is just very important. And when I say vendor management, there's really two components I think of. One's the procedural part of it is, well, how do we go about selecting a vendor, right? What are we looking for? Are we looking for someone that can tell us that they adhere to a particular security regime? Are we looking for someone with name recognition? Are we looking for price? What's the process that we use to select vendors that are going to handle sensitive data? And the second part is sort of the substantive part. Well, are they actually good? Are they doing what they say they're going to do? Are they helping us provide oversight to make sure that they're continuing to perform the functions they need to? But part of that's also the contracting process. Do we have a good indemnity clause in case they do mess up and there's a breach? Are we clear about who owns the data that a vendor is handling for us? What privacy and security will they agree to do? And that's a big external risk. The other, external risk that we see in the news every day is, the hackers, whether it's organized crime, whether it's a nation state. We're seeing a lot of attacks from Iran and China and Russia. We hear about them all the time with the DNC and the RNC. But also the hacktivists. Anonymous is out there. And, a big company may be targeted for pretty much any reason. So being able to think about those risks and manage them effectively is really important. The seventh thing is thinking about your internal risks. And I think that we were all talking on a call earlier, all the presenters, and we've all seen various studies that show somewhere between 40 and 70% of breaches are caused by employees. And sometimes it's the employee who just made a mistake and sent an email to the wrong person, but sometimes it's a disgruntled employee, sometimes it's an insider threat, someone who actually wants to do harm to the company or to profit from the data that it has. So thinking about those risks really carefully and then taking steps to reduce those risks are really important. And maybe that means having a good DLP tool. Maybe that means training people more. Maybe that means enhancing your acceptable use policy. But either way, that's a really big internal risk. The other, of course, internal risk is your network vulnerabilities, but that's going to generally be covered by some of the other steps in implementing good controls. The eighth step is to just evaluate whether it makes sense for your company to participate in industry and government partnerships. With the new CISA bill that passed, there's a lot of movement right now towards increased information sharing. And what we mean by that is threat indicator sharing. And that can be in many forms. Maybe company to company, you're able to talk to each other, and if it's done correctly, there's a specific antitrust exemption for companies sharing this type of information with each other. But, we're seeing this sort of attack increase, and this kind of code is being used to hack into our network, and it may be helpful to others in your community. And sharing information carries risk because it shows that you may be attacked, but there's ways to share that information in a way that mitigates the risk. And sometimes that's going to be company-to-company sharing. Sometimes that's going to be company-to-government sharing and government back to the company. And sometimes you'll form what's called an ISAC or an ISO, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, where lots of entities input data into a centralized clearinghouse, and then the clearinghouse will put that data back out to all the members. And that's become increasingly more common, particularly in the healthcare sector with the NHISAC. The final step that's a part of any good information governance program is figuring out how to export the risk that we've been talking about. And for a lot of companies, maybe that means buying some cyber risk insurance and breach insurance, which is, in the insurance realm, a newer product that I think the insurance industry is still struggling with how to price, but there's a lot of really good products out there to manage that risk. A lot of people have said there's two types of companies, those that have been breached and know it, and those that have been breached and don't know it. But having insurance provides a bit of a safety blanket, a safety net to manage that risk. And for some companies, it may make sense to manage that risk by hiring a third party to either manage your security or even help manage your data governance. So anyway, those are really, the 9 major steps that go into a good information governance program. They're obviously going to be different for different companies, and for companies in the healthcare sector, you're really going to be driven a lot by the context of HIPAA and the state laws that apply to you. But that's just sort of a starting point. You need to look at best practices, like what is NIST saying, what is ISO saying, what are other companies doing, and all that put together is really the foundation of a good information governance program.
So, Elliot, my next sentence was going to be, this is easier said than done, but I have to say that was probably not easy to say in the first place. So it was a lot of really good information, so I appreciate all that. That's a nice structure, and hopefully it's something that we can use moving forward for the rest of this conversation and for our clients. But the next step, obviously, is to look at this from maybe a more down in the trenches perspective, which is why we have Jeff here to participate. And so, Jeff, your question, from you leverage as much of that as you need or not, but from a practical perspective, a day-to-day perspective, what should Megacorp at this point be doing?
Thanks. I noticed we've got a couple of questions here on the side. I wonder if we want to touch those now, or if you want to wait until the end on those.
Let's get through the first scenario, and then we'll ask some questions and see where we are timing-wise.
Very good. Very good. I think that probably, and I've jotted down just some general takeaways here, but I think that in a very broad sense, there is no such thing as commencing your information governance program too soon. There's an old, I think it's a Chinese proverb, that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is now. And nothing would be more true where information governance is concerned. You've got to have the 9 steps that have been identified here are good from from the legal structural standpoint. I've always approached it that there needs to be basically it's a 3 component approach of that is people, process, and programs. The people is that you have the key stakeholders engaged. You have people, subject matter experts within the various departments throughout the organization that are there that know what records and what the content is and understand its value. And finally, you have leadership of the program that is able to drive the change and constantly be looking to improve it. You have the policies that were mentioned, a strong records management policy along with a records retention schedule that identifies what content you have, what your records are, and how long it has to be retained for either a legal, regulatory, or business requirement, and then at the end of that retention period that it's disposed of. And more importantly than having that is that you actually apply that retention period and that it is consistently applied across the organization, and that deletions, if you want to call it, or the dispositioning is done in routine, done routinely, whether it is annually or quarterly or whatever works best for the organization. But you need to be able to demonstrate that it has been done. If you're doing that, when the time, you're prepared every day for whatever comes, whether it's litigation, a divestiture, merger, or whatnot. But, again, it's about engaging stakeholders and getting their buy-in, selling what's important about it. And the important part of it, everybody talks so much about risk and over retention and things like that, but there's a real practical value that is gained from having a good information governance program, that is, information governance is a holistic approach that includes records and information management. It includes information protection, data classification, privacy, all of those things. Everything that touches the content of an organization is governed by that program. And the value of managing all of that content in a fashion is that you are retaining what you need to retain for how long you need to retain it, and more importantly, you can access it and find it. The ability to be able to find what you need when you need it is the dollar value of that can be put into the thousands if you think about how long it takes that you spend just digging up trying to find stuff that you had 2 years ago, but you can't find it now. That's kind of value propositions, and the value propositions, especially in healthcare, where so many companies are research-driven, is the ability to be able to access this information years from now and get the knowledge and the real learnings out of it for future uses. So, and that's the value proposition that you really drive. It's much stronger, really, than even the risk factors talked about. And finally, once you've got a program in place, you've got the people in place, you're dealing with all of the, that you've got the people, the process in place, you're training, people have an understanding of what their obligations are and what the value of your information is. Monitor it. Make sure that the people within the organization are complying with what the rules are. And also the monitoring is a prime opportunity to review and see where can we improve, where can we make it better, because the worst thing that can happen, or one of the worst things that can happen to an organization, is that it becomes static and complacent in where they are with their information. And it's got to be constantly evaluated, improved, and be able to address new technologies that are coming along and the new threats, and to be ahead of both of those games.
Excellent. So one of the things that I've noticed particularly about records retention and in governance in general, is that the people who are in the records retention side are very careful about making sure that things are kept for the appropriate period of time, that things are gotten rid of when they need to be gotten rid of. But then there's always the side from the risk and security managers who want to get rid of everything right away, please, because we don't want to get, have any data leakage or other issues and problems with that. So moving on to the data security side of things, Jim, assuming you're still there, one of the benefits and visions that you have from being from the consultancy and the advisory side of things is that you see a number of different clients trying to address these issues. So based on this scenario, from a data security and risk perspective, what do you think that Megacorp should be doing now?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm still here. What I'm thinking, and raise your hand on the phone, but when Elliot just went through those 9 steps, you probably thought to yourself, wow, that's a lot of things I got to do. But that's the problem I see with clients who they think they have to do all the steps at one time, and I want to kind of use a little bit of Jeff's Chinese proverb there and say, there's some low-hanging fruit from that tree, just plant it. So if you take the steps one at a time, you can, Rome wasn't built in a day, so they say, so start down the road. And as I look at the 9 steps that Elliot mentioned, I kind of think, steps 1 through 4 relate more to information governance, and 5 through 9 relate more to information security. And to just start thinking about some of the low-hanging fruit, all your organizations could look at step 1 about identifying and classifying sensitive data. And again, I look at it more as strategic and tactical. If you're going to develop your entire information governance plan and roll it out over the next 3 years on a global basis, I think that's a really strategic, thought out process. But there are tactical steps you can complete to really improve and security and reduce your risks. And, as a former general counsel myself, I never let anybody get rid of anything because when I'd ask them what was in that file share or whatever, they couldn't tell me. Well, nowadays we have the technology, and it's not that cumbersome to go through. I have a client right now who has 8 petabytes of file share data on 3,000 servers in 100 locations around the world. As part of one of their internal audit processes, they just looked at some of the file share data and found that there was secret and confidential data out there. So to assist this client, we didn't go through and rewrite their records retention policy and their entire information governance plan. We attacked the problem as it was. We scanned their file share data and helped them identify what was secret, what was confidential. We made sure we remediated that information by properly securing it or moving it to a different location. We're able to identify what we call redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. We're still in the process of that, but 60 to 70% of the data looks like it's redundant or obsolete, or it was created by Jim Arnold 15 years ago. He left the company. Nobody's ever looked at this data in the last 10 years, and he's never been on legal hold. Do we need to keep this 10 gigabytes of Jim Arnold's file share data? And even the most conservative general counsel would agree, yeah, there's no reason to keep that, which makes the general counsel there's reduced risk from e-discovery and legal risk, makes the CIO happy because he's not storing as much data, makes the CFO happy because he's able to reduce storage costs. So going back to the identifying and the classifying, what I just kind of talked about there when Elliot was talking about the policies and procedures, I see that more as a top-down approach. Here's how we should do it, but now we have the ability to come from the bottom up and actually scan some of this data to help understand what's really there. So kind of from a bottom-up approach to do that. So it's more than just policies and procedures. It's actually doing some regular testing. So some of our clients have built it into their internal audit plans that as part of their audits of a business unit or department, they actually look at their information governance policies and they look at what kind of data they have out there to make sure that they're following the program. As we talk about, that's what we call the ongoing data identification and remediation. And many of us have probably heard the term defensible deletion, which kind of gets a bad rap. We kind of flipped it on its head a little bit and called it reasonable retention. Reasonable retention requires you to look at the information, and if there's really not a reason for keeping it other than, wow, I might need that 17 years from now, there's no reason that you can't get rid of information. And I think Elliot mentioned it earlier about, getting rid of data. It's not a bad thing to get rid of information. You don't have to have special approval. You just don't keep it when you don't need it. And I want to emphasize a little more, like back to the client I mentioned, as we're going through and we're remediating data, we do document it. We log it clearly, what we found, where, and why it was deleted. So I'm not saying you can just delete data willy-nilly, but on an ongoing basis, if you, as the individual custodian of data, determine there's no business reason to keep information, you're not on legal hold, there's nothing that says that you need to retain that information. Moving on to more of the security side, Elliot mentioned specifically about tabletop exercises and being prepared for the inevitable incident. That's going to happen. So we're working closely with a number of insurance providers now, and they are still trying to get their arms around what cyber insurance is and what they're going to cover. But the one thing we really need to emphasize is you got to have your team in place now. If you wait until the day you're hacked, how do you respond to that, right? You got to get your legal folks in place. You got to get your PR folks in place. You got to get your consultants in place to help you, remediate the hack. So what we see a lot of our clients doing, they get those things lined up. They have their on-call agreements in place with their consultants and others. They do these tabletop exercises. Well, the benefit of a tabletop exercise also, when you're working with your legal, your PR, your consultants, you're getting them all there. It's like the fire drill, and you shouldn't skip out on that fire drill. You should actually go through that process so that even our most prepared clients that do the tabletop exercises and thing, when the real thing happens, it's chaos, right? But with the tabletop exercise and your programs in place, it's organized chaos, and you go through the process and you're able to more quickly identify how the bad guys got in, and more importantly, what the bad guys got to, and whether you do have notification obligations or not. If they didn't get to any of the data that had any PHI, PII, or other things, you don't have to do that. And then Elliot also mentioned the internal risks, whether it's intentional or not. We've seen, our clients, but I think the statistics show 500% increase in budgets on external risk, but very little on internal risk, when I would say personally 70% of the engagements I work on, whether it's IP theft or other things, started from the internal side. So we still got to focus on our internal risks. And with that, Brian, I think we're ready to move on.
Great. So I'm going to throw in, we've got a couple questions, and I think we're going to cover most of the subject matter in the following slides, but there's one here that I like particularly that I wanted to bring out here. There's a comment that employee PHI is generally treated to especially stringent privacy controls, but this person has had pushback from HR that no such expectation actually exists, which gets to the issue, I think, more than anything, of different stakeholders having different values and purposes and points to that, because IT, for example, could be putting on very strict controls about things when, in fact, the business or the HR department in this case doesn't. And then one other bit to it that I think is also particularly interesting is the people who actually are creating and storing and managing this data, the actual workers in your organization, need to be tied into the policy, but they will have different requirements and different actions from the different stakeholders that want to get through. I'm wondering if any of you have any comments that you'd like to make on either of those points.
Just 20 seconds from the legal standpoint, HIPAA does not apply to employers in their capacity as an employer. I think a lot of there's some misconception about it. What it does apply to is if you have an employer who is sponsoring a group health plan through which it provides medical care and insurance to its employees, then the group health plan, which is a pretty complicated issue that connects to ERISA and HIPAA and other laws, the group health plan is itself a covered entity. It sort of raises a lot of practical issues of, well, what is this group health plan? I mean, it's really just a legal entity that exists, but the people that are running it are actually employees of the employer. So it gets really complicated. I think the point of the question that was right, if you're getting actual PHI about your employees in a way that complies with HIPAA, it is really sensitive, and there are particular restrictions on how it's used and how it's disclosed.
Any other comments on that? All right. Yeah, it's, having experience in a number of corporations that are interested in doing things like protecting information and moving information around, it's always interesting when somebody, for example, and I'm just bringing this out as an example from the IT department, will say, well, legal doesn't want you to delete anything. Or they'll take on the responsibility and the authority talking for some other perspective within this discipline. And it's important to remember that legal should be speaking for legal and have everybody focus on what they know their criteria are for moving forward. All right, so the next scenario, we'll move on fairly quickly because we're going to get a little bit short on time. Basically, in our scenario, we've now reached a point where we need to have a divestiture. Due to other acquisitions, the regulators are requiring that Megacorp divest Mom and Pop's Drugs and Sundries. So Megacorp continued to expand Mom and Pop's brand until recently. It now consists of 70 stores with centralized distribution centers in each of the 6 states it services. It also has a distribution center in Frankfurt, Germany, which obviously brings up some very interesting international privacy issues. Mom and Pop's never deleted data, preferring to keep everything just in case. Megacorp, however, has in the last 4 years begun development of a records management program, but its practices are not universally followed or even acknowledged by some of the business units and subsidiaries. Megacorp must ensure that its sensitive intellectual property data is removed from servers related to Mom and Pops. So we need to split the data, and it's a corporate asset that is a very difficult thing to wrap your fingers around, and trying to split that data can be a real challenge. So negotiations with the two potential buyers are underway. We'll begin with the legal perspective. Elliot, in anticipation of this divestiture, what data privacy issues need to have priority?
Thanks very much. Yeah, for the sake of time, I'll go through these a little bit quickly. The HIPAA issue here is actually going to be relatively simple, assuming that it's being sold to another covered entity or an entity that will become a covered entity after the sale. A divestiture and giving all the PHI that they have subject to HIPAA is just a healthcare operation for which no individual authorization is required. You'll, of course, want to do it in a secure way and make sure that any due diligence that you're doing and giving the data in advance is subject to appropriate confidentiality protections. The key issue is just, do you know what data is going to be provided? And that's often the trickier part of it, but the legal part's pretty easy. The second big category are state laws, right? There may be state laws that limit the transfer of some types of more sensitive data. For example, if the pharmacy has data about someone who has HIV or that they're receiving substance abuse treatment, there is a complex set of rules at the state level and even the federal level that might apply to restrict the ability to transfer that data without getting an individual authorization. And if those apply, you have to think through, well, what are we going to do? Is mom and pop's going to send out, or Megacorp going to send out notices to everybody and seeking their authorization to transfer data? Are they just going to do it anyway and take that risk? Do patients even need to be given notice and a choice about it? It really depends on the context, what states you're in, and what data, but it's something that needs to be considered. It's not just automatically going to be permissible. The international law component is particularly complicated. We have a sort of a new regime coming into play sooner than I think a lot of people think with GDPR. The two main issues, and it's probably the most complicated of the four at the international level, is it permissible to transfer the data to the third party at all? And when we say data, it could be two things. One is it could be data about the employees who work in Europe, in which case that's probably going to be a bit easier because of labor laws in Europe. But if it's data about customers and their pharmacy records, it may not be permissible at all. And so then you'll have about EU citizens at least. But really that first question is it permissible at all, needs to be addressed. And then if it is permissible and the data is being transferred to the U.S., you need to have a legally compliant transfer mechanism. And maybe that's going to be a model contract. Maybe you're going to implement BCRs. Maybe you need to have a sub-processor agreement. It can be very, very complicated when dealing with the EU data, particularly under the GDPR regime, which will impose fines that are much more significant than exist now, 4% of global turnover for violations. So really important stuff at the international front. And then the last is really, the sort of other data category I mentioned at the beginning. So if data, for example, is being collected through a website, well, we have that law in California that requires having a privacy statement. We have the FTC's expectations about, well, did we tell people at the time we collected the data that we reserved the right to transfer in the event of a sale? If we did, then we're probably going to be okay as long as what we're doing is reasonable. But if that wasn't, if consumers were not informed that their data could be transferred, that may be considered a material change in privacy practices. And material changes, the FTC and state regulators have told us, typically you're going to need to get consent from people to do that transfer, which could really muck up the deal. So all of these things are just, there's a lot of privacy issues that could come up when it actually comes to a divestiture that you should consider.
So this next question is just a massive question. We could talk for hours and hours and hours on it, but this one's for you, Jeff, and it really has to do with data and metadata structures. We have information from mom and pops in Megacorp. Some of it's been integrated, some isn't. Some of it's structured, some of it's unstructured. So at what point do you try to separate file system organization, data, and retention schedules to make this efficient and effective? Jeff, are you there? I think we've lost Jeff. Are you on mute, Jeff?
Oh, I'm here. I had to unmute myself.
There you go.
First off, based on the scenario that we've got here where it appears that there has been inconsistent, actually no deletions and record retention applied up until a few years ago, and here in the last few years it's been inconsistently applied. The situation that you're faced there is that, first thing I would say that you're not in a position to be now trying to delete and trying to apply the retention schedule. You need to be basically dealing with all of the content in an as-is fashion. And, of course, you need to know what you've got, where is it located, what's the nature of the content, the contract that will be involved between buyer and seller will drive a lot of the discussion and plans for how you're going to deal with the separation and the divestiture, because contracts will spell out in minute terms how many desks, how many PCs, how many servers, how many chairs and furniture are being transferred to the buyer. Oftentimes the question around the data and the information is left blank, and yet what has the biggest value to the organization in the long term is the information. And so, that's one of the key takeaways there in any of these transactions is to, go in early, get a handle on what you've got, where is it located, know the sensitivity of it, and then have those discussions between buyer and seller and reach a clear understanding in the contract of what is going and where it's, what's going and what's staying. There's always the issue of content that's going to be commingled, oftentimes within the same document, where efforts have to be done to redact certain portions of that sensitive data, such as supplier lists, pricing structures, those kind of things. Also, there may be things sensitive to the intellectual property of the company, such as some formula or things like that would absolutely have to be separated out. All of that's got to get identified early on, know where it is, and then knowing how much and the volume of data that you're dealing with, and then it's a matter of applying really, really good project planning and project management to it, because that's I can't overemphasize the importance of having a good project plan in place and executing against it and putting the resources in early when you need them. You're going to need resources to identify content and identify where it is located. You're also going to need resources to actually accomplish the separation and execute against the project plan. And
awesome.
I'll pass it over to the next.
Great, and that was actually a nice segue. So, Jim, they've decided to hire your consultant company to come in and help them. So at this point, what would you recommend are their critical steps to managing data in the divestiture?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to just what Jeff mentioned about data management, right? And in the old days, I'll show my age, but as a corporate merger acquisition attorney some 20 years ago, our due diligence was, 50 bankers' boxes worth of documents in a room, and attorneys and accountants pored over those and decided if it was a good deal and we went forward or not. And when we do deals nowadays, we kind of identify, if there's a spin-off, what assets go with the spin-off, what systems go with the spin-off. But now we have the ability to go down into the data itself, into the files. And you can actually, instead of just turning over the keys to the warehouse or the manufacturing facility, go through those systems and make sure that there's no IP or other trade secrets or things that the buyer's not entitled to. And as Jeff mentioned, you work with between the buyer and seller to kind of spell those things out. But even so, you have the ability to create robust logs and show what data was removed and why it wasn't given. If there's any dispute later down the road, you still have the data that you can turn over. But I think it's very critical that we have the ability now not to just turn over, the keys to the kingdom without actually going through the data. And Jeff did mention, project management. That's a key when you're doing this type of divestiture or spinoff. You've got all the regulatory filings, all the other things, but now we need to focus on some of the data also and make sure we're planning far enough in advance to have the adequate, physical and human resources available to segregate that data. From a physical resource perspective, when you identify the data that doesn't go with the sale or to the buyer, where are you going to put it? You got to have a server to put it on. You got to have storage facilities to do that with. You got to have resources allocated not only for the entire spin-off, but resources allocated to help you look at some of the data and make the decision of whether it should be part of the sale or not. And then just making sure the entire team understands the importance of this process, right? And that a lot of folks have their day jobs to do. Some of the folks you're working with are going to be part of the spin-off business. Some are going to stay with the parent company. But if it's not clear to them that helping manage and identify and ensure the correct data goes, it just doesn't go well, right? So you got to make sure people understand that. And then when you do complete your data identification, remediation, and transfer the data, that's the key, right? You've went through, you've identified what the data is, you've remediated it, and that remediation could be deletion. A lot of our clients and a lot of the folks on the phone probably are with companies or entities who do a lot of acquisitions. And what we see frequently in the e-discovery and legal space is, hey, we acquired company A last year or 10 years ago. We migrated their data that we thought we needed over to our systems, but we never got rid of the other data. And we've got it built up. And we actually had a client who they were under government investigation. We had to go through their email system and look for current emails. Well, then we had to go back to the prior email system that they had from the acquired company because they, after they migrated the data, they didn't get rid of all the stuff they did need. So we had to go through that too. And then to top it off, the company they acquired had also 5 years before that migrated their email to another system. They still had it. So, was there any vital business information in there? No. But they kept it from a legal risk perspective. We had to go through it. If they had gotten rid of it when they should have as part of the acquisition, it wouldn't have been there. So I think we're right near the top of the hour now, so I'll wrap it up there.
Great. Yeah, we have a few more questions. I think what I'm going to do is just leave it here and say if you need answers to these questions, here's the way to get a hold of any of us. You can direct your questions to these individuals to figure out what you need. I am impressed that we ended up getting really as close as we did to the 1 hour. If it had lasted more than 4 hours, I would have had a different problem. So appreciate your time and contributions to this webinar. I'm going to now hand it back to the Bloomberg folks.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. I hope that everyone found today's discussion to be helpful and insightful. You can register for future Bloomberg BNA webinars by accessing our store at www.bna.com/learning. You will currently see instructions on how to earn credits for attending today's webinar. Please go to learning.bna.com to retrieve your certificate. CLE certificates may take 4 to 6 weeks to appear depending on the jurisdiction requested. If you have any questions about continuing education credits, please email us at credits@bna.com. Finally, I want to again thank our speakers for excellent presentations, Newick for sponsoring today's program, and all of you for your participation in today's webinar. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.